Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And we've just come back from the Mac where we've seen Neither Wolf Nor Dog, which is an independently produced film about American Indians, or Native Americans. The word used in this film is Indian, generally. The novel on which this is based is by a guy called Kent Nerburn. And Kent Nerburn is a white man and he appears in the film.
He's the main character.
He's the main character. So he is...
Problem number one.
He is invited to a reservation. He's called at the start of the film by this young girl. She's sort of teenager, early 20s. And she says, "You wrote this book, didn't you?" Which was this collection of stories told by Indian children. And he says, "Yeah." And she says, "Well, my granddad wants to speak to you." And her granddad is this 95-year-old guy called Dan. And he says no initially because there's not a lot of information about what they want, anything like that. But it sticks with him. And so very quickly he makes a decision, actually, I'll go. And what he finds there is that Dan wants to write a book of his own that shares his stories and thoughts. And Kent goes away, sits in this motel that night and writes the most banal, sort of trite sort of thing of, and it's supposed to be in Dan's words, and it's kind of, we are friends with the land and we have our ancestors, this, that, and the other. It's just the kind of shit that you always hear, and they're not very happy with it. But instead of going home he wants to go home, but he ends up sort of stuck there because his car breaks down. And in being stuck in this place with Dan, this guy Grover, who's his friend, who's another old guy, not as old as 95, but sort of middle-aged old. And then the kind of family and friends that he starts to learn about. He's a cipher for the audience, really, because he doesn't do an awful lot. And I think his performance, the performance is by a guy called Christopher Sweeney. I think the performance is really bad.
The whole film is really bad.
Well, I know you hated it.
I hated it. It was like, somebody pulled my fingernails one by one, and then I fell asleep. It was so boring. On top of it,
yeah,
I don't know if it was the pain.
I was so glad that you fell asleep because it meant that while you were asleep you couldn't go ugh, as you like to do.
The film was awful.
So I think I really liked the first 40 minutes or so, the first third, where it's just on the reservation and you're just kind of learning about Dan and learning about Grover and they're getting the measure of this white guy and he's vaguely sort of getting the measure of them, but he's really out of place and this kind of thing. I really liked it because it's not the work of a great filmmaker, this, at all.
It's a terrible filmmaker.
But it has a slowness that gave me time to think about everything that was going on. And that I really enjoyed at the start. But then I found it went into so many cliches and banalities that it just indulged. Like the thing is, it has this thing of kind of berating this guy for indulging in these cliches and not thinking intelligently or originally enough or listening to these people. But then the film kind of does the same thing. And I think what it is overall is that I think it's a really worthy film to be making, and that has both positive and negative connotations.
Yes.
And in the credits it said that there was a number of executive producers who were given that title because they contributed on Kickstarter, I saw. And when I saw the Kickstarter thing, it made the film make a lot of sense. Because I think this is the kind of film which is really worthwhile to make on Kickstarter. It's the kind of thing that you have to, I think. And I think it's so much better that you make kind of this kind of film through Kickstarter than that Blue Ruin that we saw a few years ago, which I thought was awful.
I can't even remember it.
Yeah, it was that revenge movie. So while it's not a very good film, I think it is a worthwhile one.
Well, I think I don't think it's a worthwhile. I think it's a well-meaning film, which is not to say that it's worthwhile. I think it's a well-meaning film that nonetheless puts the ego of the filmmakers kind of right at the center. It's politically very problematic. There's a white person at the center who's in charge of how the story is told and how the story is communicated, and that is already a problem, right? So, and then on top of that, you have the lousiest filmmaking ever. There's no shot variations. at all. The camera's always on a wide angle or on a close-up. Nothing is dramatized, so you have like the sense of people telling you stuff, and it's all telling you in these long shots and cliche after cliche after cliche. And it was, to me, really painful to watch, actually. The only thing that I liked about it, and I think is very beautiful, is the landscape that was shown and the way that it's filmed. The cinematography of that particular landscape is very beautiful. You do get like a love of the land and the place and so on. But the rest I found really like a white, well-meaning kind of liberal who doesn't know enough, doesn't leave the ego at the door, puts it front and center, and actually does the opposite of what it's meant to do, which is kind of, telling these other people's stories, where actually he doesn't really have the right to. And the film has this mechanism where, of course, he's called on to do so, right? Which might be an excuse for the book, but it's not an excuse for the film.
I think you're right about the filmmaker's ego, although I get more of that sense from his Wikipedia page, which appears to be written by himself.
Well, I haven't read his Wikipedia
I had a quick
page.
look. The filmmaker is the director. This is writer-director, I think. Give me a moment.
I should specify that I knew nothing about the film. I haven't read anything about the film.
No, nor had I.
So I'm speaking purely from the experience of having watched it. And then, to be fair, I found it all so dull and cliched-ridden that after, feeling like in real pain for the first half hour, 45 minutes, I kept drifting in and out of sleep, right? So I don't know how much I saw, so therefore I should probably shut up. But
well, so the director is a guy called Stephen Lewis Simpson, who's Scottish, and his Wikipedia page talks about various films that he's made, including the feature documentary "A Thunder Being Nation" that was made over 13 years about Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So. Maybe that's something, but then it also mentions a TEDx talk that he gave in 2018, which is just not something that should go on a Wikipedia page, So it's sort of fan written by himself. It also says that at 18 he was the youngest fully qualified stockbroker and trader. Citation needed. So anyway, there is a sense of kind of self-importance through that, I think. I don't think the film, in terms of the stories that the film tells, that is to say the stories that Dan in particular tells, I think there are some qualities there, and I think particularly when you get to Wounded Knee at the end, the story that he tells and the way he opens up is kind of interesting. But it's ruined really by the Kent character kind of crying and breaking down at that point, because none of that felt authentic. Awful. It was awful. It felt so inauthentic, because I think, if the film has got him to the point where he's really been learning and learning about his own sort of complicity and lack of humility and this sort of thing, then it would be earned, but it hasn't really done that. It's done the bare minimum through cliche.
The exploitation of indigenous peoples in North America is one of the great crimes against humanity, and the repercussions are continuing to this day. I from Canada, you're always hearing about kind of women who have disappeared from reservations, who went somewhere and never returned, and children that were abused in the schools that they were forced to go to, and so on. I mean, there's a million stories to tell, right? And they really should be told, and they need to be told, but this is not the way to tell them.
No, I mean, I was really looking forward to this because I mean, how often do American Indians get to be the sort of, I was going to say the protagonist of their own story. They're not even in this. But how often do they get this much of a platform in popular cinema? Not at all.
Well, yeah, but it's hardly popular cinema.
Well, popular-ish. I mean, enough to have made it to the Mac. I mean, it's
so bad.
This is not a sort of online-only release. You know what I mean? It's made it to a cinema, and so I was really looking forward to it for that reason, right? And I did find myself very let down. And I think the thing is that you're absolutely right about the fact it doesn't dramatise anything. There's one scene in the car when they're talking, when Dan's talking and the other two are listening, and Grover's sort of listening on and agreeing, and Kent's in the back just listening, and at one point Dan says something like, can you see it in your mind, or something like that, as if to say, yeah, I wish you were showing it to me.
Exactly.
You know? And so I think the fact that it doesn't do that, it means that the fact that the film is showing you people telling stories as opposed to telling you them itself through the filmmaking is not necessarily such a bad thing. It means that the story then is about storytelling and about oral history and passing things down and the pain that people live with. You know, this guy's lived with this pain for 89 years. It says, you know, at 6 years old he was beaten and he's carried these scars with him up till the age of 95. That is interesting, or at least it could be, but the film doesn't make that a thing that it's doing.
No.
It doesn't make storytelling and living with pain and that sort of thing enough of a thing that it's doing, enough of an original thing.
It's a completely amateur work. I mean, it has no idea of drama, period. Like, forget about just, you know, film storytelling. I mean, just storytelling. It has no notion. It doesn't dramatize anything. It kind of, you know, it creates these conflicts, but that have no dramatic resonance. They just seem like, you know, kind of pettiness, really. And then, like, kind of people tell their stories, but like you say, they just tell them. And, you know, kind of, they're interesting stories, and actually also they're archetypal stories, but, you know, the telling of them, it doesn't incur anything, at least for me.
No, it's to very little effect.
So, I just hated it. And actually, there is like a, you know, so one of the things about activists getting involved with, you know, like indigenous peoples and so on, is some of the things that they tell you, right? Like, you know, are you here to exploit? Yeah, or are you going to make this about you rather than, yeah? And so the film posits all of those dilemmas at the very beginning, and then the film does every single one of them, right? You know, the story is about the white guy's change, and it's about the white guy crying, right? It's like, ugh.
Yeah. And the film kind of brings up these tropes that you would kind of be very used to hearing. The thing is, everything, it felt banal to me. And of course, obviously it felt banal to you. And I think part of it is that I'm not someone with an extensive knowledge of Native American history. You know, I'm someone who is just on nodding terms with the basics. And for someone who is on nodding terms with the basics to come out of a film that is set in and around the stories being told by the experiences of Native Americans, to come out with no feeling of having really learned anything is a problem. Yeah. It's the most basic thing, and I think, you know, like if someone knew absolutely nothing, it would be like a very basic grounding in the basic tropes, like don't trust white people. Everything they tell you is a lie. That sort of thing. The history of the Trail of Tears. You know, they're in there, but in the most basic, rudimentary form. I mean, but the problem is, at the start, I felt like the film was setting up kind of interesting things. So with the Kent character, the white guy, the writer, there is this thing about he has these symbols around him of doing good, which I think come from his dad. I wasn't entirely clear, but I think the thing is, his dad was this guy who was completely selfless and did a lot of work for other people. That's the idea. There's this
rucksack.
Yeah, there's this rucksack that says on it, service over self, I think, or service before self, that belongs to his dad. There's this certificate in this box from the Red Cross, of kind of work done, and on the back of his truck, there's this Red Cross sticker. So Kent is surrounded by symbols of having done, of behaving selflessly and doing good things for other people. And there's also this book that he, that appears to be a book that he wrote. It's not to do with his dad. This book that he collected these stories of these Native American children, though you don't know what they are or anything like that. But it's kind of it gives him enough impetus for Dan to want to speak to him. But then you get to sort of actually discover he's not really a writer. He didn't write these stories. He just collected them. And when Dan says, you know, I want you to take these little stories, these kind of epigraphs, whatever they are, of mine, and turn them into a book, and he tries to, he can't do it. So to me, it was setting up something about a kind of pretended humility in him, you know, which I think kind of speaks to a kind of Native American experience of white people probably kind of coming in and saying, you know, oh, can we have a bit of grain? Can we have some shelter? We'll keep our promises. and they're not doing so. Kind of seem to speak to that, and so you get, and I think the three Native American characters that you first meet, which is Dan, Grover, and Dan's granddaughter, they do have different responses to Kent. So Dan has called him then. Dan is kind of guardedly trusting. Grover is not really trusting at all, but is kind of on Dan's side. He wants Dan to get what he wants. Dan's the elder and he's respected and that sort of thing. And then Dan's granddaughter is really not interested and is very suspicious of him and quite hostile. And I think those kind of range of responses are interesting because they do all feel authentic to me.
There's no through line. They're not things that are then kind of developed and made something of or changed or,
no.
I mean, they're just cliches, really. And some of them were incomprehensible to me, right? As the protagonist rightly says, you called me, I drove here 1,000 miles here on my own dime. Like, where is this hostility coming from? You asked me to be here.
Well, that's coming from the granddaughter who is only doing really... I mean, the thing with her...
She called him.
Because her granddad wanted...
I know, but you think he's doing a service now to her granddad? She should be at least be a little grateful.
Well, I think you're probably right, but I can still understand her hostility, and basically she's doing it because her granddad wants her to.
I thought it wasn't explained well enough. I mean, you could bring that hostility out in different ways, but there's no grounding, there's no context, there's no backstory.
I'm not sure about that. I believed it of the granddaughter. There was a thing about him not having been the first writer who came there, first person who had been invited. And obviously nothing had come of those previous ones. Maybe you were asleep when they said that line. I don't know. There was something about that, and I did kind of. It seemed perfectly logical to me that she was as suspicious of him as he was. I think the idea that he might be there to take advantage of her.
Well,
of him.
I suppose I should be asking you the questions really, because come 45 minutes into the film. I turned to you and I said, I hate this. And really my thinking was, if you hated it too, we'd leave. That was kind of, and you said, oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Right? So, that put my project to rest. So
you could have still left.
So what did you love about it?
Well, that's what I've been describing. In that opening third of the film, these questions it was setting up of exactly what's going on behind, what are these people's motivations exactly, or how are they going to sort of interact, and how is their relationships going to develop, and that sort of thing was interesting to me. Then I think the film very quickly does nothing with them, and it started to it's about the time they start to go into town and they go to the museum, and like the museum scene is kind of interesting, but it is full of cliches. There's all these bones kept in this cabinet, and Grover, who's a very sarcastic, sort of acidic character, says to the museum owner, "I think that's my great grandmother," something like that, and you go like, yeah, I mean that is horrible, and it might be true, but it's banal, right? I've seen this before, and so that's around the time I started thinking this isn't going anywhere, and these characters aren't going to develop in interesting ways.
Right. So that just means I cottoned on before you did.
Well, but I think there were things to genuinely like about that start. I think it's a real disappointment that the film squanders everything that I don't think it sets up amazing things, but it sets up enough interesting things that I was going with it, and it gave me a lot to think about early on, that I was, all the time that it spent showing you landscapes and things, and I mean it's a kind of film that will show you people driving the entire way down a road instead of just cutting to when it's interesting, But to me, I found that time contemplative rather than boring. Later on, it became boring.
It was all filler. They didn't know what to do, basically. So for me, it's a huge disappointment, because actually there are very few films that deal with this subject matter. So one feels that this is what I say, it's worthy, but it's not worthwhile, because it's the kind of idea that you support, but then comes the execution and the what you're seeing, and you go, oh my God, kind of a squandered opportunity, and one that's that is precious, because there aren't too many of them around, really. So I just kind of Yeah, I had a terrible time, and it was almost like, I had such a terrible time that I was exhausted by my own kind of thinking about it and kind of collapsed, really. So then I kept drifting in and out and in this catatonic state where you'd wish it would all end now.
Um, yeah, you look very peaceful though when you were sleeping. So. I did like its sense of humour. It's got a nice sense of humour that I like, which primarily comes through Dan and Grover fucking with Kent,
Yes.
because he's out of place and he's not arrogant, but he's not humble enough, and then they will say something to, sort of confuse or sort of set, like the thing when they go into, I think it might be Grover's mother's house, and she gives him soup, and he doesn't recognise what the things in the soup are, and Grover says, "We used to have 4 dogs," and they look at him as if, and then he's like, and then they laugh at him, and he leaves. He's very, very sort of upset by that, and it's a lovely moment where they're just fucking with him because they can, and because he doesn't, and because and to exploit his sort of lack of knowledge and discomfort and all that sort of thing. So I like that sense of humour. I think it has the occasional kind of really sharp line that isn't necessarily sharp to Kent, but it is sharp in a kind of, it just has a sort of wider sort of, I don't know, poetry to it or something like that. Like, it's some things that Dan says can be quite pointed, and I mean, I'm explaining that very badly, but there are some lines of dialogue that I just really like that kind of point at, sort of injustices, historical injustices, that sort of thing, kind of quite concisely. I mean, I wish I could remember one off the top of my head. I can't, but there are moments like that. So it's not a film without its moments, but they're few and far between, and it's a real shame. The whole thing is that the film starts off going, "Don't indulge in banalities," right? This whole thing of when he writes at the start this crap about being one with the land and our ancestors and the blah blah blah, they very rightly say this is crap, right? If you were to write about a dog, they say you would write about him pissing and shitting and farting and all the rest. So if you're going to write about us, that's what you should write about. We're not show dogs. That's what they say, which I think is interesting, right? Because especially with Grover, you get the sense he's a man with resentment and hate. It's not just kind of pain and I wish things were different. It's pain and anger towards the people that destroyed his people, right? And so you go, yes, right, this film might be really sharp on this, and then it just doesn't. It gives Dan and Grover things to say, but they're all tempered and too bland.
I found the whole thing patronising.
Yeah.
And banal.
Yeah, it is.
So...
There's very little positive you can say about it, unfortunately, which is a shame because it is such a missed opportunity, because I think it's exactly the sort of film I wanted to see. The idea of it, I was so looking forward to it.
Well, I didn't know anything about it, so I just went because you booked the tickets.
All I knew it was about Native Americans, that's it.
Right.
And that they were front and centre as opposed to, side characters or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, do you remember when we saw, was it Cold Pursuit, the Liam Neeson film, and there was a subset of Native American characters, kind of gangsters, and there's that scene where they went into the shop and saw their kind of culture and artifacts, things that are significant to them, having been commodified and made in Taiwan and all the rest.
Yes.
That's like a minute of quite concise commentary.
Yes.
That worked quite well.
Yes.
And that was kind of banal too. It didn't say anything that original, but it was, it was a good minute of that film.
Yes.
It's like, and everything that did in a minute, this film kind of takes 2 hours to do.
Yeah, it was very bad.
Yeah.
So we better leave it here because you can only say that for so often.
Yeah, I know.
So, regretfully...
wish it was better.
Yes, wish it was better, but it's not. So, thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on...
iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube to listen to. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Sorry.
It made me think of Roma as well a little bit in the sort of telling of an indigenous story. Roma did it much more effectively than this.
I just felt kind of I had little to contribute really, except my feelings, because you can't analyze because I slept through, and actually I didn't. I kept drifting in and out of consciousness, but all with that feeling of I just want this to end. I just want this to end. I just want this to end. So it doesn't kind of facilitate.
Do you want to know more about the self-obsession of the director, who I don't have any evidence for this, but he definitely wrote his own Wikipedia page because I think he also wrote the Wikipedia page for the film, because again that talks about it says Simpson released it himself directly into US cinemas in 2017, and it is still in first-run cinemas in 2019, which makes it the longest first-run theatrical release in the US in over a decade. Again, it mentions his TEDx talk. The film stars this is it. So the film stars Chief Dave Bald Eagle in the lead role as Dan, the Lakota elder. He was 95 years old at the time of filming, and it was his first starring role in a film. And then it goes on to say, the film is notable for a climactic scene shot at Wounded Knee where the script and the novel was thrown away and Dave Bald Eagle improvised the whole scene from his heart, as his family had a closer connection to the Wounded Knee massacre of 1890 than even the character he was playing. At the end of filming the scene, he turned to Christopher Sweeney, who was acting opposite him, and said, "I've been holding that in for 95 years. Dave Bald Eagle saw the film before he passed away, and he said, "It's the only film I've been in about my people that told the truth." And that's, straight from the director's mouth, I guarantee it.
I bet you.
It's nice. I mean, at least to hear, I mean, that was the best bit of the film, probably. And to see that it was coming straight from him rather than a script makes sense. Anyway, it's got 90% on Rotten Tomatoes from 10 critics, so 9 out of 10 liked it.
9 out of 10 are wrong.
I wonder who the one that didn't like. I wonder what the one he didn't like. I wonder what they said. 16 critics now. The Wikipedia's not been updated. Stephen, you better get on that. Yolanda Mercado from The Wrap says, there's far too many moments where the script demands that Kent remind everyone, not all white men, that any appearance of care or understanding is quickly wiped away. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. The thing about sort of I wasn't responsible for this, but and then he eventually comes around and goes, I wasn't responsible for this, but I feel like I am now. And he's like, well, that's a bit of a half-ass.
It's all like white liberal guilt, really. I think the film is much more about that than anything else, which is part of the problem.
Here you go. Here's a 2-sentence excerpt that sums up what we've said. This is from Ken Elsner in The Georgia Strait. A highly necessary tale is told in Neither Wolf Nor Dog. You simply have to look past amateurish direction, bad writing, and even worse acting to find it.
Well,
good work. All right. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Okay.